Hello. Welcome to the second talk on .NET Core this morning. The one thing that they all have in common is that when we pitched them 6 months ago, they were very different. I'm Mark Rendle, that's my Twitter, that's my email, that's my blog. You can use my blog as a forensic investigation of everything that's happened in .NET Core for the last 18 months, including the one which is literally just a video of me crying. But you've had a kind of introduction to .NET Core and how to run it on Linux and everything from Matt Ellis. Who was in Matt's talk before this one? I'm guessing probably most of you were. But yeah, I'm not going to assume knowledge, so I'm sorry if I duplicate some of the stuff that he said, but that one guy who was in a different talk at the first, I don't want him to get lost. That would be terrible. Okay, but the question is your code ready for .NET Core? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's it. Because they're porting every single API across now, aren't they? And it's now full .NET that runs everywhere. So of course, except maybe not, because they might not be. Look, you know what? No. So basically, I'm going to do a very quick rundown of what .NET Core is. Okay, so these are the things that make up .NET Core. You have the core CLR, the runtime. Okay, garbage collector, memory management, JITting, bytecode and native code, all this sort of stuff. Core CLR, which is Microsoft's own code, open source on GitHub, and it works on Windows, it works on Mac, it works on that other thing. We've got Core RT, we've got Core FX, we've got ASPNET Core, we've got Entity Framework Core, and then there's some other stuff in there. Okay, so yes, Core CLR works on Windows, works on Linux, works on some other operating system that's probably not important. But that's quite cool. It's fast, it's open source, you can get at it, and no offense to Miguel de Icaza or anyone else, but it's slightly better than Mono. But then you can't use it to build iOS or Android applications, which is really what Mono's been focused on for the last 5 years, and fair play to them for that. We also have Core RT, and people don't know about this as much. So Core RT is an alternative kind of runtime and set of base libraries, and it's designed for ahead-of-time compilation. So you build a .NET application, and whether you ship it self-contained or you install the .NET runtime on the machine that you're running it on, but you ship DLLs which contain MSIL bytecode, and then the CLR and the JIT turn that into something that actually runs on your machine. Core RT is designed to take the bytecode that's produced by Roslyn and then turn that into, via C++ or LLVM or something, into actual native code for a specific platform and architecture, so like for Linux x64 or Windows x64, up front, and then you ship a self-contained, statically linked, enormous binary file that just runs, and you start it, and it starts like that. There's no time necessary to spin up all the runtime bits and pieces because it's already been done. There's no JIT delay. So if you've got like a little console application and you just need it to run and then stop running and get out of the way, then you can compile that using the native compilation tools and Core RT, and it statically links any kind of dependencies, runtime binaries that you need, and it also does tree shaking, so it looks at the code that you're compiling and says, you don't appear to be using this assembly or these classes from this assembly or these methods from this class, so I'm not going to bother putting them in for you. Okay? Which comes with some limitations that we'll talk about later. But that's very cool. And you've got Core Framework, Core FX, and that is most of the base class library and most of the framework class library that's been brought across, and that's now open source, MIT licensed. And in some cases, for some runtimes, for some platforms, that's building on other open source projects. So, for example, the HTTP client on Linux and Mac uses curl, libcurl, under the covers, which is great because libcurl has been developed for 20 years and it's insanely powerful, and it would be stupid to reinvent that wheel. On Windows, it uses WinHTTP, which is great because that's been developed for 20 years and it's insanely powerful, and it would be stupid to... You get the idea. But yes, there are fewer APIs. There are not less APIs, there are fewer APIs. I appreciate you're Norwegian, but I can still try and teach you proper English. Oh, I'm getting lynched. Then there's ASPNET Core, and this is where it all kind of started off. This is a complete ground-up rewrite. They didn't kind of go, let's take MVC and just knock bits out of it until it runs. They went, right, let's build MVC again, but starting from scratch and without making various assumptions, using everything we've learned. And so now you've got this thing where there's no web API. MVC is MVC and Web API. There's no API controller. You just have a controller, and you can have an action method on that controller that returns an innumerable of spaceships, and it will just serialize those to a JSON representation of spaceships. We've got OWIN-style middleware, which we'll look at in a little bit. There's no dependencies on IIS. There's no web.config. Caveat, there is sometimes. And there's no web forms. And we've got Entity Framework Core, which again is a complete ground-up rewrite of Entity Framework, and God knows it needed it. So yeah, it's smaller, it's faster, it's lighter, and yes, those are all three different ways of saying it doesn't do as much now as it used to. Okay. Now, the reason all the other speakers have been going, you're doing a .NET Core talk, is because there's been quite a lot of controversy, because we got to RC1 at the start of the year, and then it was supposed to be RC2 kind of the end of February, and then it was out. And then they went, you know what, we're going to completely redo everything, and then we're taking away DNX and we're putting .NET in and so forth. And so the talk that I had, right, had some of these points. No more CS proj files. We're getting rid of CS proj files, and we're just using project.json. Everything's in project.json. No, CS proj files are coming back. We got those again. But that's a good thing. I got paid to say that. That's covered my expenses for this trip. There are dozens of missing APIs from the full .NET framework, and actually at the time when I wrote this, like an example of one of the APIs that was missing was web request, HTTP web request. But since then, because so much of Microsoft's own code depends on HTTP web request, they've put it back in. It's actually just a wrapper around HTTP client, but it makes it much easier to port your code if it's using web requests. So, yeah, they're all back as well. No MSBuild, and no MSBuild. That was great news because XML and it's horrible all over the place, and you got in, and then that came back as well. I don't know. It's there. You can use it. The thing is, so people here today, my brethren and sistren. We are not your typical developers, okay? We are the developers who care enough about what we do to go to conferences and learn more about it. The vast majority of the developers who use Microsoft.NET build stuff in Visual Studio, and they hit F5, and then they right-click on their website in Solution Explorer and say Publish, and they're not quite sure what happens after that, okay? And that's all based on MSBuild, and Microsoft need to cater to those guys, because quite frankly, selling something to the couple of hundred people who are in this room is not sustainable for a multi-billion-dollar company. So they brought back MSBuild. Just ignore it, use Cake, or Fake, or Sake. Don't use sake, for heaven's sake. See what I did there. So, yeah. And then the other thing that people have been getting cross about, and I don't quite understand this, is there was system.runtime and system.net, but now the MS core libs come back, and that's bad for some reason. No. No, I don't care where system.void or system.int32 are living. I don't care if they're in MS Core Lib or if they're in system.runtime or if they're in Microsoft.framework.contrib. Okay, that doesn't matter. So they're bringing all the APIs back. They're bringing MSBuild back. The biggest problem here is that what they're releasing on the 27th of June is Core CLR, Core FX, ASPNET Core, EF Core, and that's all ready, and RTM and final. But the tools and the Visual Studio tooling, the command line tooling, VS Code, all that sort of stuff is still going to be Preview 2. And then it'll be Release Candidate 1 Preview 0.5, and then it will be beta. No, hang on, just Omega. I don't know. Anyway, so and this is the point: is that your code on the 27th of June might not work with .NET Core, but for a lot of code, there is a very real chance that 6 months later it'll be fine and it'll just work because they'll have brought all the APIs back, they'll have been supporting CS proj files again. So really, the question is not if your code is ready for .NET Core, it's is .NET Core ready for your code? To quote JFK, Prince of Trademark. That was Hadi Hariri, who couldn't make it to this NDC for the first time in 6 years. But he's here in spirit and in Twitter. So, the reality. Let's just go through the different types of application that you could possibly have built with .NET up to this point, and we'll talk about whether they're ready for .NET Core. Is my ASP.NET Web Forms application ready for .NET Core? No. Seriously, just leave, get another job, anywhere else, anywhere. Just somewhere that's not doing that. Well, no, not anywhere. Don't go and do Rails, because that's just so much worse. Any Rails developers in the room, I'm guessing? Oh, yay. Do you like it? Rails 5? You love Rails 5? And 4? You don't want to throw yourself off that thing? And it's probably not far enough. You could go around and do it a few times. And I liked Rails 1. I think it's got a bit kind of baroque and big, which is kind of why I like .NET Core, because it's doing the opposite of what Rails is doing. It's not layering more stuff on, and that's why people are getting upset, is because now it feels like they're layering stuff back on. But all the stuff that they're layering back on is on NuGet, and the nice thing about it being on NuGet is it can stay there. Is my WPF desktop application ready for .NET Core? No. No, it isn't. Stop writing desktop applications, for God's sake. Seriously, browsers, mobile, everything else. Just no more desktop applications. We don't need them. Is my Windows Forms application ready for .NET Core? Yeah. No, it isn't. The fun thing about Windows Forms not being ready for .NET Core is that you sort of go, well, I wouldn't expect system.windows.forms to be there. You might expect system.drawing to be there. And no, it isn't. Which means you don't have image, you don't have bitmap, you don't have the ability to load a byte array and then tell the framework that it's a PNG and then resize it and create thumbnails and all this sort of stuff. And that is still up in the air, what's going to happen there. What I'm really hoping is that someone will create a kind of open source, really good image processing library that we can all use instead. So those things are not ready. ASP.NET Core, you might find that you have an MVC and Web API application, and that could be easier to bring across. You might not have to do a lot of work. I brought an MVC and Web API application across to beta 3 of ASP.NET 5. And actually, I had to delete some things and do a search and replace on some attributes. But for the most part, it did just work. It came across. So there are differences with ASP.NET Core versus traditional ASP.NET. And these are the things that are going to hit the majority of people. There's no IIS integrated pipeline because you have to assume that there's no IIS. There might be IIS. If you're running this on Windows, there's probably IIS. But if you're running it on Linux, in a Docker container, in Amazon Web Services, then there's no IIS. Okay? So there's no web.config. So all the stuff that you would have put in web.config isn't there anymore. You can't do that. You have to put it in code instead, which is a good thing, in my opinion. There are new standard libraries for doing certain things. And there's no bundling or web grease. So when you want to minify your JavaScript and turn your less files or your Sass files into CSS files, you have to use the same tools that the rest of the world uses, instead of just creating a bundle and letting .NET take care of it for you. Again, this is a good thing. You should be happy that bundling and web grease have gone away, because the stuff the rest of the world uses is a little bit better. Uglify, for example, for minifying JavaScript. Uglify is the best JavaScript minifier you've never used, unless you've used it, in which case, yay. The reason it's the best is because it has a flag that you can pass in, --screw IE8. Because it turns out that all the other browsers can cope with an extra level of minification, but it makes IE8 cry. So, what does no integrated pipeline mean? So the things that are part of the integrated pipeline are HTTP modules and HTTP handlers. So IIS knows what these things are, and it can load them up inside its own process space and do various things before the code ever actually hits your .NET process. Okay, and you get stuff like static file handling, for example, is in there, which means you don't need to say handle these static files. It will just go, there's a file called that. I will download it for you. That's convenient and nice and everything, but if you Google web.config, you will find that quite a lot of people have not configured the static file handling in IIS correctly, and that you can download the web.config from their website, which is awesome. Generally works best on those sites where all the pages end with .aspx, obviously. There's no IIS authentication, so you can't say do Windows authentication or do basic authentication or whatever inside IIS, so we have to handle that ourselves as well. And there's no application pools, right? So if your application leaks memory, and and that's been fine because every 20 minutes you recycle the app pool and it releases all the memory and starts again, you're going to have to fix your application. Okay, it was going to happen sooner or later. Just put your big boy pants on and fix the fucking memory leak. Okay, all of this has been replaced with middleware. Okay, so middleware is, Rails guy will know about this, rack. Ruby has this thing called rack, which sits between web servers and applications and handles turning streams of bytes into requests. Okay. Now Kestrel handles the turning of streams of bytes into requests, but then we have a series of middleware that basically says, okay, pass me this request, and I'll see what I can do. I can modify the request, I can inject information into the request for other stuff to use later on, or I can reject the request, or I can handle the request. Okay, so I just want to take a quick look at some code. Can everyone see well enough? People at the back there. Yep, I'm seeing thumbs. If I can see your thumbs, I'm guessing you can see my code. Right, so this is a startup class here. And we've got this iHosting environment comes in at the start up there, but then we've got configure services, and we'll talk about what that is in a moment. Okay, and then we've got this configure here, and this is the real middleware part of the application. Okay, so we've got, we're adding a developer exception page. So where in web.config you would have said custom errors mode equals remote only or off or whatever, we now handle that by saying, okay, is this the development environment? And the way we work out this is the development environment is there is an environment variable, ASPNET core _ environment. Okay, if you set that to development, then env.isDevelopment returns true. When you ship into production, you set it to production, and then different code runs instead. And it's great, you know, because previously all we really had as a configuration option here was, do we show the yellow screen of death, yes or no? Whereas now we can say, if we're in development mode, or in staging, or in test, or you can basically, any string can be an environment name, then you can say use the developer exception page, use the database error page, write some extremely complicated logging information that takes a long time to extract that I wouldn't want to be doing into production, into Logstash or Raygun or wherever you send your errors to. Otherwise, just use this exception handler and redirect to our home error page. Okay? We have app.useStatic files. If you don't put app.useStatic files into your application, you won't be able to serve any of your static files. And when you say app.useStatic files, what it uses as the root by default for those static files is this folder here, www.root. And everything in there is a static file, except web.config. Funnily enough, there is a web.config hiding in there for IIS if it's using it. And everything that's not in there is not a static file, which is just really nice and easy. Okay? Use static files. You can't put an index.html file in www.root and expect it to get served. If you want to do that, then you have to say app.useFileServer or something. Let's see if I can... app.useFileServer, yeah. So that's, if you're running, you can just run a static website. You could literally take everything else out and just in configure, take MVC out, take everything out, and just in configure have app.useStatic files and use .NET Core as a static file server. Which may sound like a weird thing to do, but if you look on NPM for Node.js, there's a static package that is used just to do that. Okay? App.useIdentity. So that's adding in identity management and basic authentication. And if you can, if you install a bunch of Microsoft authentication libraries from NuGet, then you can add Facebook and add Twitter and add Google and add Microsoft Live with Passport.net. Whatever it's called now. Microsoft account, I think it is at the moment. There's an Active Directory and an Azure Active Directory plugin for that as well, and obviously you can write your own. You can also use Identity Server, which I highly recommend if you want to do federated authentication. Just spin up Identity Server version 4, I believe, runs on .NET Core. Spin that up. Use that as your authentication thing. They've got middleware that you just drop in here saying use Identity Server, and then you can just forget about it. Okay. And then use MVC down at the bottom. If you don't put use MVC in there, then your controllers will never get hit. So there's some new bits in there as well. And we're going to talk about those now. We have dependency injection is now built in. So in MVC, it's always supported dependency injection, and basically what you do is you go, right, I'm going to use autofac or ninject, or structure map, or Unity, or Castle Windsor, or the other thing. And then ASPNET MVC defers to that and says, create me a controller. And handle its dependencies. We now have dependency injection built in, and that is in the configure services section up here. Okay, so we have iService collection, which is sort of like, it's somewhere between a container and a service locator. But you get your service collection and you say, okay, I'm going to add my DB context, that's entity framework in there, so I'm adding my database context as a service, and then I'm setting the options to use SQL Server. You could also have options.use PostgreSQL, other databases as well, but outside of those two, I really have no idea why you would be using that. Stop it. Unless your friend is a DBA, in which case you want to ensure his continued employment and success, and so you'd probably want to use Oracle.
So yeah, and we say services.add_identity, and you can configure all your identity providers and everything else in there. And then you can see that this is a proper kind of dependency injection system here, because we've got add transient, email sender, and SMS sender. Those have been added in automatically because Microsoft's auto-generated identity system lets them put in an email address and a phone number for password recovery and two-factor authentication and all that sort of stuff. Okay, so that's now you might say, well, I don't want to use those things. I want to use structure map, or I want to use autofac, and I completely wouldn't blame you. And what you can do is you can hook structure map or autofac up as the provider, as the container for the built-in dependency injection system. So if you've got an ASPNET MVC 5 and Web API application, then that's using autofac, and you've got like 1,000 lines of setup of all your dependencies, right? It takes about 12 lines of code, and you can say to service collection, use this as your IOC container, so like services.use container, and then pass your autofac container or your ninject container in there. Do you see how I don't favour any one in particular? I keep using different ones because I'm just that professional. Unity's shit though. So configuration has changed as well. Configuration, there are two ways of doing configuration. I mean, there are obviously millions of ways, but there are two sort of out-of-the-box ways of doing configuration in an ASP.NET application. You can just put stuff into app settings and connection strings inside your web.config, and then when you do your release, you have to use the built-in publish so that it will do the XSL transform and apply the values from web.release.config, which the thing I find amazing, and the thing that says to me we are in a time of great progress, is that 5 years ago that was the best way to do that. So look how far we've come in 5 years, where we've worked out that there are other ways to change information than using XSL transforms. Yes. So now you just you have various different kinds of configuration and so forth. Oh, the other place you could put it was you could actually create this really complicated class structure, which would then map to a whole section of your web.config file. And if you look at nlog or log4net, you can create a log4net section, which has then got strongly typed bits inside there. And we don't have that anymore. We now have, if we go back up to the top here, we have this configuration builder. And with Configuration Builder, you can use environment variables, you can use JSON files, you can use command line arguments, you can write your own configuration provider and plug it in there, and that could pull data out of a database, it could pull data out of table storage in Azure, you could use console or etcd. If you don't know what those things are, you probably want to learn sometime over the next 12 months. If I come back next year and you still don't know, I'll be very cross. And the really nice thing is we've got, if you look at these two lines here, we've got add JSON file app settings.json, okay? And if I go down here, I can open up app settings.json, and that has got connection strings, default connection, and that's got my thing there, and logging settings and so forth. And then we've also got app settings. I'm just going to try and select this. Sorry, my laptop screen. My laptop is very, very old, and the screen resolution is only 1440 by 900, which doesn't project well onto there, so I have to work from here. So this is a C#6 interpolated string. You can tell because it's got the dollar at the start, which means that anything inside curly braces is evaluated as as a variable. And so we're saying app settings.env.environmentName.json. And so if you've got an app settings.development.json, then it will pull that in. If you've got an app settings.production.json, it will pull that in. No XSL transforms, no web deploy publish step. It just looks for a file with a particular name and it uses it. Now what you should be doing, here, because you don't want to be putting your connection strings into any kind of file and checking it into source control, is you can say .add environment variables at the end, and then when you launch the process, you say connection strings underscore underscore user database equals, and then a connection string for PostgreSQL or SQL Server, and then you launch the application with that environment setting. That's the correct way to do it. Or you use a distributed configuration thing like console or etcd, so you can just change these things on the fly. And people are writing configuration builder.add console, for example, to automatically talk to that. Okay. User secrets, I've never successfully got to work, but that's a way of keeping those values on your machine in an encrypted file, which is quite handy. And then you just build that out. And then you can create strongly typed option settings from that. So I could create a class called connection strings and add a property to that called identity database. And then I could say in services, I could say use this class and pass in the configuration setting there, and it would create a strongly typed class for me there. Much easier than the other way of doing things, the whole XML mapping thing. Okay, and then there's logging. And logging is very important. And logging on Windows, there's been lots of lovely ways you could do logging. You could write to trace. You could write to event tracing for Windows. You could, so it would go into Windows Event Viewer and all this sort of stuff. And you could use nlog and serilog and log4net and various other logging libraries. The problem, so two problems. One problem, funnily enough, Linux doesn't have event tracing for Windows. And it's really, I don't want to talk about what it does have, because what it does have is journal D. Yes, let's use a binary format for our log files. It used to have syslog, which was great. But it has journal D. You don't actually want to write to any of those things. What you should be doing now, really, is writing to standard out and standard error. You just turn your error message into a string, write it to standard out, and then have something running outside of the process, which is monitoring standard out for that process, and just then shipping that off to Logstash or whatever. If you're running on Linux, what you do is you have fluentd, and you tell fluentd to watch the standard out from other processes, and then fluentd's configuration says if it comes in on standard error, send it to Raygun, otherwise send it to New Relic or Splunk or whatever you're using for that. The other problem with the old way of doing it is, okay, so I've got my application, and I like nlog, and so I'm going to use nlog, and I'm going to set nlog up with dependency injection so I can have an nlog logger injected into all my controller classes. But I'm using this, this library over here, which turns PostgreSQL into a document database. I'm using Martin, okay? And I like Martin, and it's great, and you know, it turns out PostgreSQL is the best document database ever. And that's brilliant, but Jeremy doesn't know that I'm using nlog, so I have no way of getting log messages out of there. On Windows, everything wrote to trace, and that was fine, because you just set up trace listeners. But we don't have that anymore. So now what we have is built in to ASP.NET Core, built into the Microsoft framework layer, we have logging. And so down here, you can see when we're doing our configure, we say logger factory. Okay? Now, logger factory is just there. I don't have to say I want to use this. I just install the package, and then logger factory is available. It just adds itself in automatically. And then I can say add console. I can say add debug, and it'll say, all right, if I'm running in Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code or something that supports debug, then I'll write to the debug output in there. If you know you're going to be running it on Windows, then you could say logger factory.add etw or add trace. If you Generally, I would recommend just write it out to the console, okay? And there's configuration in there, so you can say, if I'm running it on my desktop machine, so if env.isDevelopment, loggerfactory.add console, stick some color in there. But if you're running it in production on a server, don't stick color in there, because those just come through as control characters into your log files and make them hard to search. Okay, but this means that anybody who's writing a library like Martin or Simple Data or Nancy or whatever can just go, right, I'm taking a dependency on Logger Factory. When you put me in your application, you'll get that anyway. You're probably using it already. And so I can say loggerfactory.getLogger, and I will be writing to the same place that you've decided you're going to write to. And if where you want to write to is serilog or nlog, then you can say loggerfactory.addNlog, and you can bring all your nlog code over or your serilog code over. Serilog in particular, because that does weird structured things and it's very cool. So yes, you can bring that across as well. So all your existing logging code that you're doing lovely things with will still work. You just add them as an output for Logger Factory. And the really nice thing is that then everything will be writing into them as well. Okay? At HTML .editor4 in particular, but also action link and so forth. They're still there, but you won't want to use them when you see what's there instead, which is tag helpers. Tag helpers are just completely brilliant. I'll show you some tag helpers. Let's go into here. So again, when you are in development, you want a different set of HTML rendered most of the time than you do when you're in production. Okay, and there's a really nice tag helper. So when you're in production, you want your CDN. And ideally, you want your CDN with fallback, so it'll fall back to your thing. But when you're in development mode, you want to use the unminified JavaScript and CSS that's on your machine, because you don't want to be trying to run your website and then, because you're on an aeroplane, you can't, because it can't get to Cloudflare or MaxCDN or whatever. So there's a tag helper in the views. Generally will still work. You can just copy your views across for the most part, but you'll want to edit them to add in various new bits and pieces. Hello, did you get my double click? Yes, you did. There we go. Right. So look here. This is a tag helper. Basically, that is saying if we're in development, it's saying right-click menu. If we're in development, then use lib.bootstrap from my local stuff and site.css. Otherwise, if we're in production, then use these things here. Those are tag helpers. They're a little bit like the old ASP dash or ASP colon text box things from Web Forms, but it's best not to think too much about that because it will make you feel dirty. So instead, we think of them as like more like Angular or Web Components, or you know, the sort of custom element names, except these are handled by Razor. So that's a simple example of it'll either output what's inside it or it won't, and then it will just disappear. The other type of helpers we have are attribute based tag helpers. So in an ASP.NET 5 MVC 5 application, these would say at html.actionLink and then home, comma, index, home, comma, about. Okay. And now we say ASP-controller is home and ASP-action is index. The reason this is nicer is because of the bit after it, where we're saying class is navbar-brand. So this has always been the problem with HTML helpers. Whether you're saying action link or editor for, you want to be able to say this is a navbar brand link, this is a danger link, this is a form control and a grouped button or input or whatever, and you had to pass in an anonymous object with the values for the attributes that you wanted to pass in there as well. If you wanted to put like ARIA helpers and that sort of thing in there. And of course you couldn't put class in as a property in that anonymous object that you were passing in, because class is a reserved keyword in C#. They use it for something. I can't remember what. But you're definitely not supposed to use it as a property name. And so they had to add a special case thing where they had a class parameter for all. And now it's just much easier. You just write the HTML for the thing that you want to generate, and then you add these couple of ASP-attributes to it, and it takes care of that stuff for you. So those are tag helpers. So again, like I say, HTML.this and .that and .the other, still there, will still work, but move away from it, move towards this stuff, and it just makes your code much nicer and cleaner and easier to work with. Right. The other thing you'll need to do, which I don't have a slide for, is clean up. So all your Web API controllers currently derive from API controller. Don't do that. They just derive from controller now. And actually, they only derive from controller if you need to use any of the built-in functions that are on controller. If you are literally just getting a dependency injection DB context and pulling a list of spaceships out of your space station docking database, this is my demo app that I always use because I like Elite. And No Man's Sky and stuff. Let's just go and play that. But no, if you don't actually need the stuff from the controller-based class, you don't have to inherit from it at all, which saves a lot of time creating and tearing down the thing. And the attributes have changed. You've got attribute routing. It used to say HTTP GET, comma, root API / something. Now, because someone worked out that that's stupid, you just say HTTP GET and then pass the URL in as a parameter to HTTP GET or POST or whatever. Also, things like action filters. The big advantage here is that the MVC action filters and the Web API action filters are the same action filters. You don't have to implement two sets of action filters, one for your page controllers and one for your API controllers. It's all bundled together. They're pretty much the same. Internally, they all sort of default to being asynchronous. The whole framework, right the way through, defaults to being as asynchronous as possible. Performance suffers probably a bit for that, but actually get the same hardware and run an ASPNET MVC 5 and Web API application on IIS on Windows, and then run an ASPNET Core application, and you will see orders of magnitude in terms of performance increase. It is ridiculously fast. Entity Framework Core. Who's using Entity Framework in their applications at the moment? Yeah. Okay. Entity Framework Core is code first. You can make it work with an existing database, but it is code first. You create the classes, you put the attributes on the classes to tell Entity Framework how to map them to the database. You can no longer go to SQL Server Management Studio, hold down the mouse button on your database and drag it onto Visual Studio and have it generate 4.5 million lines of XML and 8 million lines of classes that you will never use. Some people are quite cross about that. And I think the best thing to do is to eat those people. I suspect they would taste like bacon. So, you've got db.ensure database at the moment, yeah? When your application spins up in your application start or app setup or whatever you call db.ensure database, and it runs the migrations for you. That's still there. Again, it's kind of for backward compatibility, but we now have db.migrate, which is much more sensible. You can pass in specifically which version of the database you want to get. The difference here, right, the reason you want to switch over to db.migrate is db.ensure database doesn't create the migration history in the database. It just makes sure the database is right. db.migrate does it the kind of one migration at a time and then keeps the history, and so you can do db.migrate down and so forth, which is quite handy. And we now have the .NET EF command line. So Matt before was talking about this new .NET command line. We've had this weird situation with Visual Studio and the package manager console for quite a while, where it's there for install package, but then you're supposed to use the package manager console to add migrations to your project. I suppose Entity Framework is a package, so it makes sense because of that. Anyway, Matt mentioned that .NET, the command line thing, is extensible, and you can just create .NET-whatever.exe, and if you put it in the right place, .NET will go, yeah, I can do that. And so there is a .NET-EF .exe, and then there's a .NET-EF-add, which will add a migration, and everything. You can run migrations and so forth. So you're using the .NET EF command line. The nice thing about that is it does work from the package manager console, but it also works from, CMD or conemu or CMD or whatever you're using. It works from PowerShell, it works from the command prompt, it works from Bash, it works on your Linux machine, it works on your Mac machine. Databases don't work on your Mac machine, but you know, .NET EF will work on there for you. So yes, Entity Framework, there's a bunch of stuff that isn't in there, but for the most part, unless you were doing really kind of weird, horrible things, Entity Framework will still mostly work the way you expect it to. The really nice thing is, as we saw in the configuration section there, you can basically just, because ASPNET Core and the dependency injection system and everything are in there, you can now just say services, and you can just add a DB context. So you don't have to create a wrapper around your DB context and then pull that in, and so it has an interface and so forth. You can just say services.addDB context. That takes care of hooking it up and setting connection strings and everything else. And if you've got logging set up and you've got verbose logging turned on, then Entity Framework will write all its logs to wherever you have your other logs going to, so you can get all your generated SQL written out and so forth. So yeah, so that's nice. Who's going to miss EDMX files? Damn, I wanted a bacon sandwich. So, .NET Core. This is the thing where people have been getting stressed and going, oh no, they're bringing back everything and we're losing everything and I hate everything. Right. Now, this may not be right. It was right 45 minutes ago when this talk started. Things that are gone. App domains. App domains are gone. I don't like app domains. I find them incredibly annoying. It's very hard to write code that works inside an app domain properly. It's very hard, definitely very hard to write code that sits sort of either side of the app domain boundary and works reliably, because things have to be serialized to binary across the boundary. It's hideous. It's absolutely hideous. Okay. The one thing app domains are good for is if you need to load an assembly like a plugin or something, and then you want to get rid of it without restarting your process, and then load another version of that assembly, then app domains are good for that. But there's a new thing called assembly load contexts, which is used throughout ASP.NET MVC, and you can load things in using that, and you can actually have multiple copies of the same assembly in different load contexts at the same time, and you can just pass objects to them. It's lovely. It's brilliant. Keeps them all separate, sort of sandboxing and so forth, so don't miss app domains because we have load contexts instead. .NET remoting is gone. Again, that was a hideous hack to make it look like this class here existed on this machine here, when it didn't. There was actually an ISDN line in between the two things. It's one of Microsoft's very early .NET. Don't worry about complicated things like that. We'll take care of it. Just pretend you're writing a Windows Forms application. So that's not there anymore. You're actually going to have to write networking code if you want to do networking. Sucks to be you. Binary serialization has gone for much the same reason, and currently code access security has gone. Now, strong naming had gone, and then they brought that back. We also lost assembly-neutral interfaces and assembly-neutral types fairly early on in the process, and I did weep a little for those, because they were great. Code access security is the thing where you can say, right, you need full trust or partial trust or whatever. Now, obviously, Linux systems don't have full trust, partial trust. They basically have all the other users and root. And if you're running as root, then yes, you can rm-rf/, at least until it gets to /user/bin/rm, at which point it will stop. So code access security is gone. Now, these things may come back as NuGet packages that will only work on Windows. Okay? Things like app domains and binary serialization and .NET remoting, they could be brought back as NuGet packages, and if you are happy to say this is a Windows-only application, then you can use them with those various constraints. That's good. That means that people who've got enormous investments in code that use these features and are happy to continue paying Microsoft's increasingly expensive server core license prices can carry on using their code, and they can migrate over to this new thing. And the rest of us who want to write applications that we can spin up on Linux boxes, or this new serverless architecture, I don't know if you've seen this, but someone's worked out a way to run processes on the moon and communicate with it using lasers, which is fantastic, literally. And we can do that, and we just don't download those NuGet packages. So don't get cross because Microsoft are going to release some NuGet packages to increase backwards compatibility with the old .NET framework. Getting cross about that is just mean. And God knows the people who need those NuGet packages have got enough problems in their lives without you being mean to them. Okay? Stop it. There are some things which are changed, okay? And I'm just going to flag up two. The cryptography APIs, again, they seem to be introducing some shims, but you've been using RNG Crypto Service Provider or AES Crypto Service Provider all this time, okay? You don't know that those have been deprecated since .NET 3. When Microsoft released Vista, one of the things they introduced was a whole new cryptography subsystem inside the kernel, which is using CNG, cryptography next generation APIs. And so there are all these CNG ways of doing things as well. And when they did .NET Core and the core framework, they went, you know what, we've had the deprecated or obsolete attribute on RNG service provider for a hell of a long time. Let's not port them across. And so they're gone. And again, backward compatibility packages coming to bring them back, but it is better to use CNG in the same way that it's better to use HTTP client because web request is just an abstraction around it. It's better to use the CNG APIs because the crypto service providers, if they do create them, will just be a shim or a wrapper around those, and obviously you want to be close to the metal. Reflection has also been up and down. Reflection wasn't available on things like WinRT and the Universal Windows platform, which meant they took an awful lot of things off of type. So when you did object.getType, you couldn't do get properties, get methods, get fields, get this, get that, get the other, invoke, all this sort of stuff. They moved all of those onto a type info object that was not available in .NET, in Windows RT, and then you had get properties and get methods and everything off there. Now, there's some talk about whether they're moving things back and everything else, but we need to talk about reflection more deeply anyway on the next slide. Let's go to the next slide. There we go. There's a slide. So, yes, things that you shouldn't count on. Right. Who uses reflection.emit in their code or compiled link expressions? Yeah, one person. You're wrong, all of you. Who uses JSON.NET? Yeah? Who uses Dapper? Who uses Entity Framework? Who uses ASPNET MVC Web API? And any of these things. All these frameworks, all these libraries that you're using and plugging together to build your applications, inside, Dapper uses reflection.emit. That's how it can map SQL data readers to classes so fast. JSON.NET, I'm not sure if it's reflection.emit or compiled link expressions. My simple data library uses compiled link expressions all over the place because it's quicker to generate a bunch of code once and then reuse it over and over again than it is to keep saying type.method.invoke. Okay, but if you're happy that your application is going to be a self-contained application that runs with core CLR on Linux and Mac and Windows, or with the runtime on Linux and Mac and Windows, then it's fine. You can use reflection.emit, JSON.NET. All these things will still work. If you are thinking, I want to build one of these nice, tight, statically linked, pre-compiled, ahead of time executables, then reflection.emit, you know, it doesn't have a JIT. There is no just-in-time compiler. It's not there. You're not going to ship a just-in-time compiler inside the runtime code for native compiled code because there's no bytecode in there, which means you can't generate bytecode and then have it JITted at runtime. Now, there are people working on ways around this, and whether they'll get there or not, I don't know. But for now, what this means is that you can't native compile an ASP.NET MVC application. All right? What you need to do is go to the Roslyn issues page and demand hygienic macros for C#. We might get them now because Anders has gone, he's doing TypeScript. If we can get hygienic macros for C#, then we can generate JSON serialization classes and route handling classes and all these things at compile time and then have them native compiled. If you look at things like Rust and Go, that's how they work. Rust's JSON library generates Rust code at compile time that then handles JSON serialization. So yes, that's probably gone. Things that are obviously gone, so we've already said Windows Forms, WPF, ASPNET Web Forms, you poor bastard. Win32 Interop, obviously. If you want to write an application, again, if you're working on Windows, if your entire infrastructure is on Windows and you're building an intranet application, then fine, yes, you can carry on doing Win32 Interop and using shell execute W or whatever. But if you want to write an application that you can put into a Docker container and run on a Linux box, or that anyone can deploy wherever they want to, if you're selling a kind of bundle this and put it on your own infrastructure .NET application, then you haven't got Windows 32. Just assume you haven't got Windows 32. Just assume you haven't got Office, okay? So you'll want to write some kind of wrappers around those that can be optionally loaded and say, if you've got Office, then do this. If you're on Linux, then use those, and so forth, okay? Those are basically gone. To finish up with, so hopefully you've got a rough idea of whether your particular code base is ready for .NET Core now. I kind of called out the big things. C# still works, but everything else still works, okay? It's still classes, it's not scary and new, everything is still normal. C# got some nice new features. I hated string interpolation when they announced it. I thought, that's terrible. I love it now. It's so good. String.format. ReSharper just goes, you got string.format in there, you're stupid. You want to change that to string interpolation? You're like, God, yes. Yes, I do. So yeah, you can go through and you can clean up a lot of stuff, and you've got like the new way of doing properties and read-only properties. You can just create a property that's just got a getter, and now C# will let you set the value of that in the constructor, which is great. But are you ready for .NET Core? Are you ready for like the next 10, 15 years of .NET development? So these are the things that I think you should probably be looking at learning to make sure that you are either doing the best job that you can where you are, or more importantly, that you are portable to other businesses who may be willing to pay you more or have a ping pong table. Linux, including Bash, and I promise you, once you learn Linux and you learn Bash, you will agree with me that PowerShell is an abomination, a blight upon the face of shells on computers, and we should all just use Bash. If you're using Windows 10, when you get the threshold or anniversary update, just download and run Ubuntu inside Windows, and it's got Bash and everything works. Just learn it, it's great. Okay, but you're going to be running stuff on Linux. You need to know how Linux works. You need to know about daemons and systemd and journald and fluentd and lots of words ending with d. Okay, you need to understand how that's working. You need to understand the web servers that you're going to be using when you deploy code onto Linux, because you are going to reverse proxy your Kestrel application behind. I use Nginx. I've used HA proxy. I've worked on things that used HA proxy. That's very good. HA proxy is better for load balancing. Nginx is great for single servers. I've actually worked on things where they used an Nginx proxy per single server and then an HA proxy load balancing to all of them, which was just weird. Apache is still there, bless it, but you won't be using like mod mono anymore. You'll be reverse proxying, so learn all about that. You'll want to learn Node.js and NPM and Gulp and Webpack, because WebGrease is gone now. I wouldn't worry too much about Bower. At this point, pretty much everything is now in NPM, so just worry about that. You'll want to learn Docker. This is, obviously you'd have to learn Docker. Even if you don't know what Docker is, you're vaguely aware that you need to learn it, right? It's cool. and it's Docker. But no, this is how we do DevOps now. This is how we do publish. Okay, you create a Docker container, you push it up to the Docker registry, you bounce onto a machine, and you pull it down and you run it. Okay. On Saturday, I did a talk at Microsoft in the UK, and it was a demo kind of workshop thing. And so my idea was I'm going to start from scratch, empty Visual Studio, create an application, debug it in Docker, which you can do on Windows now. Run Docker for Windows Beta, run the VS tools for Docker, F5, and it hits, and you can step debug through it while it's running in Docker. Push the container up to the Docker registry. Use Terraform to create an Ubuntu 16.04 server in Azure on a Linux VM and install Docker onto it, SSH onto it, and then pull Docker and run it, and it was there. Okay. And I thought, that's great, I've got an hour. That'll be a nice kind of demo. I turned up and they went, you've got 30 minutes. And I still did it. All of that in 30 minutes, okay? Because Docker. And various other things. Terraform also. Paul Stack, I think, is doing a talk on infrastructure as code with Terraform. He may have already done it. If you don't watch it, it's brilliant. And then the other thing you want to learn is Python. Because there's all sorts of stuff that you want to script, and Bash is great, but you get to a point where Bash doesn't work properly anymore, and you need to interact with like the Docker daemon directly or various things. Python as a scripting language is fantastic. Don't use it as a web development language, that's just stupid, but as a scripting language, it's superb. It is just without peer. Okay, so that's all the stuff that you should still be learning. This is all the stuff that's still awesome about .NET Core, and the reason we should still be positive about it. It is cross-platform. We can run on Linux. That's much cheaper and in some cases a lot faster. We can deploy self-contained applications that have the runtime inside the folder, so you can just X-copy it. You don't need to install a runtime. You don't need to worry that this new version of the .NET framework is going to break this old version of the .NET framework. Everything, literally everything, including the CLR, is a NuGet package. So you just download the bits that you need and you don't download the bits that you don't need. And eventually, for a specific subset of code, we will have native compilation with static linking and stuff, and people can finally stop going on about fucking Go. That's it from me. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the conference.